Caroline Knowles of Cognitive Law. I specialise in property litigation. We're doing a series of vlogs following the recent changes to mediation. I'll let you introduce yourself, Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire Henley and I'm a commercial mediator and I work for a company called Cachet Associates.
Thank you. In our first blog, we looked at the changes and also the implications of mediation and the process itself a little bit. Claire, can you tell us what a mediation day would look like for you as a mediator?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a highly confidential process, and it's also what's called without prejudice. Caroline, can I just ask you to explain exactly what without prejudice means in this context?
Sure, without prejudice is something that us lawyers refer to quite a lot when we're having communications with the other side. In particular, as you say, mediation is subject to being without prejudice and it's confidential. So the without prejudice elements means that it cannot be referred to later on if it goes to litigation. It's not something where any comments and evidence discussions of things that may be over and above the actual content of the mediation subject matter that might be part of a settlement would be discussed. They can't then be brought out later.
That's really important for both parties to understand right from the onset, that they can literally discuss anything within the mediation and it literally won't come back to bite them. When you get to a mediation day, there will be a signed agreement to mediate, which both parties will have signed the agreement, and mediators will not commence a mediation until they definitely have that signed. A lot of mediators will request payment in advance as well for the mediation day, and that's again something that you could discuss with your mediator when you are choosing your mediator. Mediation could take place on Zoom. About 60 plus 64% of mediations last year took place on Zoom. I think technology most people are very familiar with now. That can really help if there's a level of animosity or discord, really strong discord between the two parties. But it can also take place face to face, and you can still keep parties separated in that situation where you might go to a conference suite within a hotel or something, and the mediator would move between rooms physically, making sure that each party had their own private room where they could spend the day.
Do you think there's any advantage to an in-person or Zoom, Claire?
I think it very much depends on the nature of the dispute. So it could be, for example, if it was a commercial dispute, that it would be useful for it to be in person. But if it was where emotions were running very high, then it might be much more advantageous for that to take place on Zoom. Other thing, of course, as well, would be the duration. So if it's a relatively small case and it's felt that the mediation would only take maybe a couple of hours or maybe a morning, then to save people travelling, it seems sensible that that kind of mediation would take place on Zoom. But if it was going to be a full day, people might find it quite tiring to be on Zoom for the whole day. So there's a whole balance of things to take into account. So once the parties have had their initial meeting, the mediator may decide to do a joint meeting just to kick off the whole process. And that's very much determined by the nature of the dispute and how the two parties are. In your experience, Caroline, how often would you have a joint kick-off meeting within a mediation?
I don't think I've ever had one, and I think that's just as a result of the nature of the beast. At the stage they come to me, it's usually extremely highly fraught, shall we say. And so I've never had one. It might have the lawyers with the mediator, perhaps a joint one towards the end, but say in my experience, and that could just be my particular area of law, joint ones have been avoided at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be down to the party's preference, and also the mediator would advise on that as well. The mediator will then undertake a series of meetings with each of the parties in turn to get a really good understanding of each of the parties' position on some of the other factors that might be playing into the dispute. And this is one of the key benefits of mediation, that a mediator can explore all sorts of things that would never be able to be brought up in a more formal process in a court of law. It wouldn't just be about the specific contract or the invoice. It could be any number of other aspects that we refer to as interests and issues, which could all be feeding into the situation. Caroline, have you got an example of a time where you've had a mediation where there's been several elements to the dispute that have come out through the mediation?
Yes, so with the property things, particularly, boundaries are notoriously tricky, and there are often other annoyances, I would say, that are sitting in the background of that dispute, which can be all wrapped up in one go. Those things only really get teased out through the day, I think, with the mediation, that you find that he or she said or did, and that then can also hopefully be put to bed at the same time. It's quite common.
Yeah, thank you. So through the course of these private meetings, as I mentioned before, and I'll keep reiterating, they are completely confidential. So each party can feel very confident in being able to express absolutely everything and get anything off their chest that they feel they want to during those meetings. The mediator may occasionally ask if they can share that information with the other party. And they might think that there's something that's come up that would be really useful to share, but they would only ever share that with the express permission of the party they were talking to at the time. And quite often, what a mediator would do, certainly what my preference always is to actually play back the words verbatim, absolutely clear that the mediator is not putting any favour or any judgment on the information that they are sharing to the other party.
That's certainly been my
And
experience of mediators, that they do that. Yeah.
it might feel a bit weird in a mediation. You're saying, well, I've told you what you can say, and now you're saying those words back to me. But it really is critical, isn't it? Because just one word said in a slightly different way or chosen differently can actually sway the whole meaning of that information you're passing through. So after a number of meetings back and forth, generally what tends to happen then is that one party or the other might say, look, actually, I feel like I'd like to offer something to the other party. So that's when we start to talk about what might form part of the agreement. And within a mediation, the actual settlement agreement can have any number of items as part of it. And they could be things that are quite unusual, certainly not something that would be perhaps in the court of law, but they might be, well, there are several aspects to this dispute, but as part of the agreement, then I would like to put forward 1, 2, 3, or 4 different aspects to the settlement as well. And that is absolutely not unusual in a mediation. And it kind of plays to the strength of the mediation that what we're aiming to get to is a win-win situation. So both parties come away feeling that they have got some wins and some recompense or some feeling of achievement from the mediation, but it's not that they have had to concede everything and the other parties walked away scot-free. So these discussions that take place, we do gradually get people into what we call the zone of potential agreement. And then we'll start to try and craft a settlement agreement and a number of criteria within that settlement agreement from those discussions.
I do try and
So,
ask clients before they attend a mediation to think of what a win might look like, so that they can walk away at the end of it feeling that they've got what they wanted, even though it is a settlement.
yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things as a mediator that I would do is ask people to prioritize the things that are really important to them and then things that are less important. So it might be that they'll be willing to concede something that's less important, but be a little bit more dogmatic about what they want in the agreement for the things that are more important to them.
Mm.
So, Caroline, you've got a client and you've sort of talked to them about what they might look for, what they might hope to get out of a mediation. Have you ever had a situation where the client is still absolutely adamant that they will not mediate?
Fortunately, yes, I have. It's not that uncommon, unfortunately. And that's where, so the job of the lawyer really is to understand their position, but then advise them fully about the implications of not mediating. You can perhaps not mediate at the outset, but then once you get into litigation, you sometimes have a timetable that says you have to mediate from the court. So understanding that the client gets why they need to, and what might happen in terms of costs if they don't is really, really important. That is our job to do really at that stage before they do just point blank refuse. As long as they have that understanding of the risks, then that's as much as you can do sometimes. But generally, eventually, people will try and mediate. Even if they don't reach a resolution, they will have a go.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to focus again on that settlement agreement, I mean, it may be that there is an element of that agreement that is a point of law, and it might be something that the parties would have to discuss with their lawyers. But any other elements of it might be things that are not actually bound by any contract or any legal situation. So they can be things that the parties will be willing to offer up or accept totally outside of that. So a mediation settlement agreement can have, as I said before, a number of elements. But once that mediation has completed and that settlement agreement has been drawn up between the two parties and signed by both parties, it is binding on those parties, isn't it, Caroline?
It is indeed, yes, absolutely. And that's why it's important that the parties understand what is in that settlement agreement, because once it is signed, you're right, it's absolutely binding.
And that's quite a good thing about having the back-to-back meetings where the mediator goes from one party to another, because it does give the party who is not currently talking to the mediator an opportunity to seek advice if they need to. But that might be from somebody else within their company or their lawyer if the lawyer is not present, or discuss it with a family member who also has to agree it. And the other critical thing to say about mediation day, of course, is that the two parties that are there to mediate, they must be the decision makers. It is a crucial step that the two parties that are there mediating have the power to accept the terms of any agreement.
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, I think that takes us to the end of this one, where we've talked a little bit more about the mediation process, about what the day looks like back and forth, what the individual meetings are, emphasising, of course, the fact that it is entirely confidential and totally without prejudice. So anything that is shared in the mediation cannot be then used any legal proceedings going forward should the mediation not result in an agreement. They do have a very high success rate and proving to be a very effective method for resolving disputes across a whole range of items. So thanks very much for listening, and we will be back with a third vlog shortly. Thanks very much.